So hey everyone, what I wanted to do was to create a video in which we talk about rhetoric and argument. Since we know English 302 is a class that focuses solely on rhetoric and argument, I thought it was important that I create a lecture that can kind of introduce you to these concepts, right? So there's a couple things that we should know. That rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can start talking about rhetoric, or before we can start talking about an argument, we need to talk about what is rhetoric. So generally in a ground class, what I would do is I would have students take out a piece of paper and I'd ask them, okay, I want you to define the term rhetoric. And if you were to look at the expression on students' faces when I asked them merely to define the term rhetoric, some students looked panicked. Some students looked uncertain, right? Girls want to cry, guys want to drop the class, right? And so then I sort of have to segue and sort of break down rhetoric. So I ask class, I say things like, okay, so how many students in here have never heard the term rhetoric before? And there'll be a few students who will raise their hand and admit they've never heard the term rhetoric. So if that's where you are at the start of class, that's fine, it's normal. There are cases where some students admit they've never heard the term rhetoric. Then I'll ask a different question. I'll ask students, well, how many people had heard the term rhetoric and weren't able to define it? And there's several more students who at least they've heard the term rhetoric but don't know how to define it. And then there are the brave souls who actually say they can define rhetoric itself. So given that, I want to kind of slow down and walk you through what rhetoric is. And so generally what I ask a ground class is I say, can I make the case that there are people who use rhetoric? And just about everyone raises their hand. So it's safe to say that we know that there are people who use rhetoric. So then the question becomes, who are these people that use rhetoric? And anytime I teach a class on rhetoric and argument, whenever I ask who are the people who use rhetoric, immediately students can say politicians. I can take a class where no one knows what the definition of rhetoric is, but when I ask people who use rhetoric, politicians are always the first people that comes to mind. And that would make sense, right? Because if you think about it, in the last couple of years, you probably heard someone say, hey, President Donald Trump is using rhetoric. Don't know what that means. It goes one ear out the other. You might hear people say, oh, Joe Biden is using rhetoric. So we've heard that term. We don't know what it means, but we know that politicians use rhetoric. The second group that is always associated with rhetoric is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. And if you think about it, what lawyers are paid to do is they argue cases in a court of law. So it would make sense that people would think of lawyers when they terms of rhetoric. So if we think about this for a second, we know that politicians use rhetoric. We know that lawyers use rhetoric. Then I might ask, well, what disciplines in college use rhetoric? Well, sometimes students say philosophers, and that makes sense, right? Because we might associate Socrates, Aristotle to rhetoric, right? English teachers use rhetoric, right? Sometimes students say writers use rhetoric. So what I want to do is, okay, look, these are just the people who use rhetoric. We have lawyers, politicians, philosophers, English students, writers. Then we might also say students use rhetoric. Students use rhetoric and they're not always very good at it. So once we've talked about the people who use rhetoric, then I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. So since we know that politicians always use rhetoric, I want you to imagine right now if I turn my camera and sitting right next to me was former President Barack Obama. So we know that if I turn my camera, here's former President Barack Obama, we know he's going to use rhetoric. So I always ask, what is it that Obama is doing? And sometimes students will say, like, he's talking, he's giving a speech. So notice a speech can be a form of rhetoric. So if we know that a speech can be a form of rhetoric, right, then I always ask students, well, how many people have I've heard Obama speak? And a lot of people will raise their hands. And they say, how many of them see speak live in person? And not very many people raise their hands. Well, how is it possible that you've seen him speak but not in person? Well, someone will say TV. So notice TV becomes a form of rhetoric. If TV is a form of rhetoric, that might mean that radio is a form of rhetoric. Another form of rhetoric might be movies, right? So the internet might be a form of rhetoric. If we go back and look at the example, the people who use rhetoric, we know writers use rhetoric. That might be a form of rhetoric, might be a book, a newspaper, a magazine. So all we've done then is said, okay, there are forms of rhetoric, whether it's a speech, whether it's a movie, TV, radio, the internet, and email. These are all forms of rhetoric. We know that there are people who use rhetoric: lawyers, politicians, philosophers, English teachers. Now I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to mislead, deceive, and con people. And sometimes that definition can really shock students, right? Because students can be a little confused. They can be like, well, what? So I will define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. And so here's what I want you to do in a discussion board, right? I want to know, based off this lecture, and there's a couple other videos underneath, I want to know, how would you define rhetoric? You can agree with my definition, you can disagree with my definition, but how would you define rhetoric and why? And that'll give us it's kind of a reference point that we will kind of play around with. So I'll look forward to seeing how you decide to define rhetoric, and then that'll give us the basis of the class to play around with.